Possible conflict of interest in your assets. It's very difficult to believe.
Look inside yourself, Rosemary.
It's because it's all made up anyway.
So where is the incentive to hold the government to account if your newsroom is reliant on the government for its survival?
Gang, what's up? Aaron here, Canadian Looney. Smash the like, hit subscribe. We're going to pop over to some Canadian Heritage Committee action. We've got Sheila Gunn Reid. She's the chief editor for Rebel News, and she has a lot to say about the state of journalism in Canada. Let's get educated right here with Sheila Gunn Reid. Let's check it out.
I want to start with Sheila Gunn Reid. Sheila, you're both the editor-in-chief of Rebel News as well as president of the Independent Press Gallery. You're saying that, I know that your organization's been in business since 2015. You're very well known. You break news stories, yet you say you're being shut out by the Liberal government and others. So tell me a few specific examples of how you've been shut out.
Well, I can speak directly to the Liberal Party of Canada. I mentioned in my opening statement the most recent convention. Our reporters were denied accreditation, and they were subject to doing walk and talks outside of the venue. But that's not the only way that we're shut out of being able to hold politicians to account on behalf of the public in this country. Press galleries, including here in Ottawa, but in legislatures all across the country, keep our members from joining. Now, Alberta is a specific exemption to that sort of practice. Even though the Alberta Legislature Press Gallery voted to keep Rebel News journalists out, we were able to be accredited through the Speaker's office because the Alberta government has a commitment to engaging with journalists all across the political spectrum. But it is bizarre that a cabal of your competitors can get together after receiving government subsidies to protect their exclusive access to politicians. That's not how journalism is supposed to work.
It seems that these days the vast majority are getting direct.
Okay, that's.
It seems to me that the vast majority of media outlets are getting direct funding from government. So isn't it inevitable that this would impact their objectivity?
Well, we listened to the opening statement from the Canadian Media Guild, which implied very strongly that the majority of newsrooms in this country are government subsidized, directly or passively through tax credits, through the Qualified Canadian Journalism Organization tax credit structure. So where is the incentive to hold the government to account if your newsroom is reliant on the government for its survival?
So tell us a bit about Rebel News, the size of your organization. I would guess that you might be a larger organization than some of the press gallery members here in Ottawa. Can you give me some specifics about your audience, your reach, et cetera?
Well, we are, depending on the day, Canada's largest independent news organization. We have journalists all across the country. We have journalists in Australia. I'll give you an example, during the Freedom Convoy, despite the fact that the CBC building is right across the street from where we're sitting right now, our coverage of the Freedom Convoy dwarfed the CBC because we had independent journalists firsthand in the streets talking to people. And the media landscape is changing. You don't need satellite trucks, and you don't need expensive newsrooms anymore. And yet, because of the government subsidies to failing news organizations, these organizations are not experiencing the market correction I think they so rightly deserve. They are not innovating because the government is hindering that innovation through subsidies.
I was a member of the press gallery in Alberta, and I find it personally really galling that the Ottawa Press Gallery won't allow you to be a member. How does that even happen?
I mean, the press gallery itself is self-governing, but with that self-governance comes a certain level of protectionism. If working journalists in this country from all parts of the political spectrum want to hold their government to account, they should be able to. They should be able to work on the Hill. They should be able to scrum politicians from the left and the right and speak to their audience. But the fact that this doesn't happen is reflected in the failing of the media landscape. Nobody watches the mainstream media anymore. The viewership of the CBC is a statistical rounding error. Why do they think that is? It's because they do not reflect the diversity of this country and the political spectrum, regardless of what their CBC mandate says that it should. People are not tuning in and watching the mainstream media anymore because they don't think that the media cares about them. They are not being treated honestly by the media. And that's why the media keeps coming hat in hand to the government looking for more.
Shouldn't Canadians and other journalists be troubled by this?
Absolutely. When we see the decline in the trust in the media in this country, we can point directly to how the media behaves. You know, I'll give you an example of this. During the leaders' debate, there was some controversy that broke out in the media room. Now, all of that was caught on video. Independent journalists were subject to workplace harassment inside the media room at the Debates Commission. Rebel News journalists were at the heart of that. The CBC went on air, accused our journalists of misinformation, and then denied us the right of reply. In fact, instead of offering us the right of reply, they called the SPVM on us. That's not appropriate journalism.
Thank you. Our time's up for that question.
Sorry to interrupt, gang. Smash the like, hit subscribe. We work really hard at this stuff. Let's get back to the video.
This is our fourth meeting on the state of journalism and media sector, so about 8 hours. How does media ownership impact fairness in media? So I'm going to go to you, Mr. Menzies. You've had 3 decades in newspaper. You were with the CRTC as vice chair for 4 years. And yet, when I looked at the National Post, owned 63% by a hedge fund in the United States in New Jersey, Chatham Asset Management. That was, I think, in this country a turning point. All of a sudden, the newspaper industry, the major newspapers in many cities changed when that happened. And I don't have to tell you, when you go down Deerfoot Trail, and the iconic Calgary Herald building has now been sold, and the letters of the Calgary Herald are off the building, and it's now a U-Haul facility. Just your thoughts on how the media ownership, how could we let a hedge fund from the United States buy our most precious newspapers in this country?
Well, first of all, I sort of cross myself every time I go by that building. But the how? Well, the companies were emerging from bankruptcy under CanWest, and that was how Postmedia was initially set up. And then the ownership structure has changed over the years. I suppose it happened for the same reason subsidies became popular, because the companies were too big to fail, and politicians don't like massive failures on their watch. So you tried to get the best deal you could, even if it wasn't a great deal. In terms of the ownership setup, when you have a hedge fund, you have an entirely different financial model, which you need to feed the beast. That becomes the priority, right? There isn't time for long-term thinking. There isn't time for long-term structures, that sort of stuff. You need to make those payments, and you need to make them on time. That becomes the priority. That can be a big a big issue. You don't, if you have a proprietorship ownership like the Globe and Mail, you can appeal to the owner to be patient and hang on and not lay people off and try to invest in journalism. And I think that approach has generally worked pretty well for the Globe and Mail. But essentially, if you have a free press, that means you can be whatever you want. And you know, the only time it makes a difference is now that the government has got into funding. Now governments and people such as yourself, Mr. Waugh, have to look at it and say, what are we funding here? Are we funding a hedge fund or are we funding news? Which is why I think one of the ways out of that is to get around to funding the consumer. Let them choose what they want to read or not read, and, you know, subsidize that through tax credits to them. Then the market can actually work. And you get some sort of feedback, you get a flow-through impact to successful operators. But you know who owns what and how, in my 30 years in the business was never the government's business.
Well, when you were on the CRTC for the 4 years, you had 10 years there as an advisory, along with Conrad Van Fichtenstein. The problem, and I was at Bell Media. So telecommunication companies like Bell, like Rogers, all of a sudden started buying assets in this country. And so where do you see that? Because you were there during Bell Media taking over CTV Network. You were there when others like Rogers started to do Sportsnet and so on. So where is the fairness in that, or is it just the telecommunication companies like Bell and Rogers and so on have deep pockets and they can do whatever they want? And when you were at the CRTC, it was kind of a rubber stamp when, in fact, they did buy CTV Network and others.
Well, they can't do whatever they want. Because they make a transactional agreement with the CRTC that the CRTC gives them a license, and the CRTC, and in exchange for that, they agree to follow certain guidelines and certain rules. That's what happens with all broadcasters.
Let me say this, though. I come from Saskatoon. Bell Media no longer has a weekend local newscast. When I was there for 39 and a half years, we had a noon, 6, and late night. We no longer have a weekend newscast. So I will challenge you on the CRTC, because I've had Miss Vicky Atreides in this room. They no longer follow up with local television news, check-marking what their license was supposed to do. So it's changed from when you were there for 10 years to where it is today. They're too busy with other things going on. You know, the CRTC, as you know, was radio and television. Now they're trying to regulate the internet. And there is the problem. You were there. You could hardly do radio and television. And I just gave you one example of Bell Media not fulfilling their contract of doing local news in Saskatoon and Regina on weekends at 6 and 11:30 at night.
That was
sure, that happens, and they probably wanted to stop because nobody was watching
Mr.
it.
Menzies, I don't mean to cut you off, but I think Mr. Waugh made his point himself. I gave him some time to finish his statement, and I will...
We'll wrap it up right there, gang. Smash the like, hit subscribe. Aaron, Kennedy, and Looney. Hope you learned a little bit in this video about Canadian journalism. Sheila Gunn Reid is sharp as a tack. Catch you in the next video. Thanks for watching this one. Ciao for now.